this is not purely a legal process, but a technical, not purely a legal process, but a political process. If somebody questions it and says, you are wrong, Mr. Senate President, if one senator says, and that senator who questioned Senator Sotto would have the majority, then Senator Sotto can say goodbye to the Senate presidency.
Dating Senate President Franklin Drillon, prangkahang sinabi na maring mamaalam sa pagka-Senate President si Tito Sotto sa kanyang gagawing aksyon. Welcome back to Kaakibat TV. Nitong nakalipas nga na araw ay humarap sa one-on-one interview si dating Senate President Franklin Drillon kasama ang host ng Billionaire News Anchor na si Pinky Wave na kung saan naging exciting ang kanilang usapan ukol sa proseso ng impeachment trial ng pangalawang Pangulo na si VP Sara Duterte na kung saan naprangkahang sinabi ng dating Senate President Franklin Drillon na ito ay hindi legal na proseso kung hindi ito ay isang political process.
Alam mo, Pinky, how it is interpreted will depend on the majority in the Senate. And as we have said a few minutes ago, this is not purely a legal process, but a technical, not purely a legal process, but a political process. So,
okay,
so from there, you can draw anything.
okay. So, you saw nothing wrong with the AMLA showing up in the House of Representatives, in the House Justice Subpoena. Yes, sir.
They were subpoenaed.
And
so,
showing these documents, yung pong concerned and suspicious transactions. No problem there.
No problem there because they were subpoenaed, and this is part of the impeachment process, and Congress is a separate body, and under the rules and under the Constitution, they will be the exclusive judge of the impeachment, and the complaint is part of the impeachment process. The impeachment process starts with a complaint. So you cannot say that this is not an this is the House is not authorized to subpoena because impeachment is an exemption from the bank secrecy law.
And in fact, the bank secrecy law, okay. And in fact, in their rules, in Section 7, it actually allows them because Congress, the House of Representatives, according to the Constitution, shall promulgate its own rules.
That's
and in their
right.
Section 7, it said that they can issue subpoenas, etc. But this is where the argument is actually being raised, that there could be a violation.
Well,
is the word I'm using.
That's right.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, the Senate must decide. And the Senate has the exclusive power to interpret.
What were your thoughts about the report of the AMLA? 6.7 billion pesos, Senator, in inflows and outflows. I spoke to the defense team at Attorney Michael Poe, and he was basically saying, let's be careful with this because ito po ay aggregate. Aggregate meaning kung ano yung nilagay mo, 10,000, withdraw mo, 10,000, 20,000. Naglagay ka ulit ng 100,000, magiging 120 yon. Nagtanggal ka ng 120, 220. In other words, lahat ng pinasok at nilabas mo, padagdag po sila ng padagdag. In fact, if we were just to show them the inflows and outflows, let's put that back on air, lumalabas po that the outflows for both was 1.55 billion pesos. The inflows, 4.43 billion. So meron pong sinasabing undetermined transactions of 791.1 million. Senator, again, what are your thoughts about that report coming from the AMLA?
Firstly, I have not seen the AMLA report, but from the media reports, they have reported the inflow and the outflow, as you just suggested. There is certainly more inflow than outflow. Is that so?
4.43.
Yes, for over 4 billion. This must appear in the statement of assets and liabilities because these are covered transactions under the Anti-Money Laundering Act and also covered by the law on SALN. You are supposed to report your assets. Okay. The other argument was that, I heard it, these are not ours. These are only parang nakapark lang. That's crazy because the law is statement of assets and liabilities. So you must state the asset. If you say this is not mine, that is a liability, and therefore you must report it. It's not reported, so it's a violation of the law.
And speaking of SALN, again, there are questions on the Vice President's Statement of Assets, Liabilities, and Net Worth. We jumped to the SALN. Of course, medyo kaugnay po ito nung AMLA report. There was, I know it was Congressman Joel Chua who checked it and saw that there were no cash on hand or cash on bank. I'm not sure if one or both. Basta there were 6 years na wala daw nakasulat na cash on hand si Vice President Sara Duterte. Is that odd?
Is that?
Odd.
Well, it is odd in the sense that the bank records are already made public. And certainly there is cash in bank at the very least. And that is an asset no matter how you argue it. And that is why you are required to report it in your statement of assets and liabilities and net worth.
But 6 years of no cash on hand or cash in bank?
Well, firstly, the actual records proves that is wrong. The actual record presented by the AMLC shows that there was cash.
Inflows and outflows.
Inflows and outflows, in fact.
And to follow up on that, Senator, Attorney Poa was saying that nalagay ho kasi sa others, hindi po nalagay doon sa cash on hand or cash in bank. It was put in, I think, others or various. Is that acceptable?
I haven't seen this SALN. I do not know what others. As I said, you are supposed to state your assets and your liabilities. So that's in law you give it a plain meaning. So and
assets, it's assets, liabilities,
and liabilities, and the form required of public officials when they submit their SALN is that you specify what are your assets. Bank deposits are assets. No matter what you say, no matter
I think there was a Congressman Ridon, who had asked for a clarification, that might not be the right word, or the format that must be used for the SALN if there is cash, if it can actually be put in others or others or various. I think hiningi niya po yun, and I remember Congresswoman Jinky Luiser said they can, pero they have ruled on probable cause already. So, the box of BIR records. There was a box, Senator, with the ITRs or bank records of the Vice President and her husband, Attorney Mans Carpio, to which the congressmen and women decided not to open.
Well, because it is only an investigation to determine whether the complaint is sufficient in substance. The matter of the ITR or Internal Revenue Reports in the judgment of the committee, there is already enough to establish that there is sufficiency in substance. And they didn't want to risk that anymore because the law specifies that you cannot make the income tax return public except in an executive session and
in aid of legislation.
So they were concerned that there could be arguments in favor of their having opened those BIR accounts, but for what? I suppose the theory of the committee that let it be tackled in the Senate because we do not need that for purposes of establishing substance.
Probable cause.
Probable, yeah. Establishing that it is sufficient in substance. We do not need the ITR records.
But that vote had been made. 38 said would not open it. I think 6 said let's open it. Natalo po yun. Let's open it. But just in general terms, can does the Justice Committee have the power to open that box without violating any law?
Well, the law specifies that it must be opened in executive session. So they could have done that. But
Was it in executive session and in aid of legislation, or in executive session?
I can't recall exactly, but one thing I remember is that it must be in aid, in executive session. And yeah, probably in aid of legislation. So again, there can be a debate there, So,
But this is definitely not in aid of legislation.
So
Senator.
certainly. But then it goes to the Senate, and since the House is only determining whether or not there is sufficiency in substance, why should you risk going with the other party going up to the Supreme Court?
So you agree with that decision?
I
to open
fully
the box?
concur with
All
the
right.
decision.
Okay, now let's go to what will happen. A committee report on Monday that will be signed by the House Justice members, and then at some point, days after, this will be brought to the plenary, where they expect heated debates, because this is the time everybody gets to vote.
That's right.
And they need 1/3 to be able to confirm, impeach the
Yes.
Vice President.
Matapos nga magdesisyon ang House Justice Committee na di umano may basihan ang dalawang impeachment complaint laban kay VP Sara Duterte na kanilang tinalakay, ay inihayag ni Senate President Tito Sotto na agad nila aaksyonan sa Senado ang forthwith na articles of impeachment laban kay Vice President Sara Duterte, na kapag dinala na ito ng Kamara de Representante ay agad sila kikilos. Ngunit sa paliwanag ni dating Senate President Franklin DRILLON, ay prangkahang sinabi nito na kung sakaling may isang senador na magtanong ukol sa gagawing aksyon ni Senate President Tito Sotto, ay baka ito na ang dahilan na mag-goodbye na si Tito Sotto sa pagka-Senate President sa Senado. Para sa buong kwento, narito ating panoorin at pakinggan ang video. Narito ang video.
When it gets to the Senate, sabi na po ni Senate President Tito Sotto, agad-agad. They will convene, sabi niya, even the day after they receive the articles of impeachment. Again, presuming that aabot po ito sa Senado. Quick question on this, sir. Did you get any clarification with the Supreme Court ruling on forthwith? Lumabas po ito very recently, April
Right.
29. Ang sabi po ng Supreme Court, ang ibig sabihin po ng forthwith, within a reasonable time, which may be longer or shorter, depending on the circumstances of each case.
Nobody agrees with that among the legal profession. I mean,
Yeah, you look, yeah.
but having said that,
But did it clear it
No.
up? Did this
the rule in statutory construction is you give the word its ordinary meaning. Now, forthwith, what does it mean immediately now? But the Supreme Court said no, it's not necessarily so. But they said that it is discretionary, and the interpretation of the Senate is superior as to when they will convene. In other words, they recognize the jurisdiction of the Senate insofar as the interpretation of forthwith is concerned. So, Senate President Soto said it will be tomorrow. And unless he is overturned by the majority, then the trial will take place.
But that is my question, Senator. Is it going to be up to the Senate President to decide now what forthwith is? Because if the Supreme Court says within a reasonable time, which may be longer or shorter depending on the circumstances of each case, that becomes a judgment call of the Senate President.
It is a judgment call of the Senate President which can be reversed by the plenary. But until the plenary reverses it, he sets the date. Okay, we start convening tomorrow. If somebody questions it and says you are wrong, Mr. Senate President, if one senator says, and that senator who questioned Senator Soto would have the majority, then Senator Soto can say goodbye to the Senate presidency.
So I guess at the end of the day, it's up to the 24 senators.
That's correct,
Yeah,
because
hindi
we
lang
are
po
an
si Senate
independent body.
President.
And at least the Supreme Court recognized that the Senate can interpret it in its own discretion.
Yeah, because basically there was a ruling also part of it, not in these words, that it's not just up to the Senate President, but the impeachment court itself. Basically saying it's up to all 24
that's
of
correct.
you.
That's correct. But the way it is implemented is the Senate President And the majority leader, presumably with the support of the majority, says the trial will take place on June 1 or whatever. Unless the majority of the senators says no, we will hold it in June 1 of next year. That stands. Now, if the majority of the senators says no, it should be on June 1 next year, then that's the end of the Sotto presidency.
But did this decision of the Supreme Court make the meaning of forthwith more vague? Did it add more questions, or could it have been an easier response on what forthwith means?
I agree on the latter. It should have been an easier response. But as we have been taught in in college, the Constitution is what the gods of Padre Faura says it is.
Yeah.
So we accept that. I accept that as a lawyer.
All right. Do you see an impeachment trial happening as a last question, Senate President?
Yes, sir. I think the Sotto Senate Senate President Sotto has said it will take place, and he interpreted forthwith as immediately. And that is something that the Supreme Court should no longer interfere with.
Former Senate President.
Hanggang dito na lang ang ating video, at kung nagustuhan nyo, huwag kalimutan mag-subscribe at pindutin nyo na rin ang notification bell para ma-notify kayo sa ating susunod na video. Maraming salamat!
30 p.m. here on BNC, the Billionaire News Channel.